Welcome back to another episode of Liminal Phrames. I'm your host, Nathan, and I'm joined by my friend and co-host, Darren King. Darren, it's good to catch up with you again. It's been a few weeks, and I like the pacing of the shows now. It gives me a little bit of time to work on some other things that are going on in my life, both work and personal, and enjoy a little bit more time with family as well, which has been great. You've been quite busy, though. I know that you've been doing a good bit of traveling, and you've got some courses that are going on. How do you juggle it all? I have found that reducing my podcast involvement has been a benefit for me, but you've basically said, nah, I'm doing more. So how do you manage to do all this stuff?
Well, first of all, I would say that the podcast repetition is fairly regular. It's one podcast a week, whether it's Liminal Phrames, Point of Convergence, one of the feature series, whether it's Event Horizon, I do one a week. That seems very doable. If you remember when we first talked about doing Liminal Phrames back in the day, I thought I would do Point of Convergence once a week, in addition trying to fit in Liminal Phrames every second week. Crazy. So the podcast repetitions feels very manageable to me, but there are other things going on as well. Like you said, I just kicked off these 2 classes this week. So for the next 12 weeks, I'll be teaching classes on Tuesday and Thursday nights, in addition to prepping for Point of Convergence, Liminal Phrames, Event Horizon, etc. And I was also just down in Houston at Rice University to work on a project that's being done in partnership with Archives of the Impossible. That was an excellent trip. Really enjoyed being in person with people. You and I have talked about how nice it is to actually meet in person. Even in the most recent class for Cosmic Awakening, which is made up of people, some of which were at the retreat in Idaho, and each of them actually mentioned how nice it was to actually see each other, meet each other in person. So I'm looking forward to doing more retreats in the future. But yeah, it's been busy but exciting, and I wouldn't trade it. And on top of all that, as I was just telling you, I got a brand new kitten named Willow, who's sleeping off to my right here, very chill, and that's a nice addition to my life as well. How are things for you, my friend?
I love it. Yeah, things have been good. It's been busy, but my kids just went back to school last week, so we're getting kind of that order restored in the household, I guess you could say, which is nice. The downside is you got to get them to school, pick them up, that kind of thing, but we do like the routine, and they seem to be having a good time at school so far. Knock on wood, that continues. My family life has been really strong and positive. Just for those of you who don't know, I live close to both my parents and my wife's parents, and my sister even lives nearby. So there's a lot of folks that are in Western North Carolina that I can lean on as a support network and just enjoy spending time with. So I feel very fortunate in that regard to have these loved ones close by. So things have been good. I finished my month-long ruck challenge that I set for myself in August. For those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, I decided to do a little weighted vest walking every day in the month of August. So I did that, completed it, felt great about it. I'm going to keep going, maybe not every day, but more often, which will be another sort of challenge for me just to keep that habit engaged. And, during that whole time, I've been watching what's going on in the UFO conversation. I keep a close eye to what's happening in the social feeds, see what folks are talking about there. And I've been reading Lue Elizondo's book that came out just a few weeks ago. I've been thinking about that a good bit and talking about it with both those who are already interested, but also even with those who know nothing about it. I brought it up to my parents, and they were really, really interested in it. Had lots of great questions, kind of those initial questions that you think people would ask when the light's starting to come on, that this might actually be a real thing. And so that was a fun conversation to engage in. All I have to say is, Darren, I think we live in some really, really interesting times. There's a lot going on in the world, a lot to be excited about, and a lot to be, I think, a little bit cautious about. There's this sense of something happening soon, and all of us, I think, feel it in some way or another. Elizondo tapping into that very directly with the title of his book, Imminent, which I think we're going to talk about a little bit on the show today. So where do you want to kick us off in this episode?
Well, yeah, I think we'll kick in with a discussion about the book itself, and then we'll kind of move to conversation around how much this has moved the needle or not in terms of the cultural conversation. Of course, it's interesting to finally see this happen, the publication finally happen, because this was something that was rumored and then known about and talked about in ufology circles for months and months prior to it coming out. I think many people had questions around how many new revelations would there be. I think some people in our community have pointed out, rightly so, that we forget sometimes that the information that's designed to move the needle for the public is not necessarily the kind of information that's going to be titillating to those of us in ufology. We tend to be very knowledgeable about this space and about the lore and whatnot, and we tend to be very up on all of the relevant cases, for instance, in terms of UAP. So in that sense, that kind of proved to be true in the book. I think you and I would both say that there's nothing that's groundbreaking in terms of case studies or something that we had never heard about. But it was an interesting tale, certainly, of not just his professional career and how he stumbled into this particular platform that ended up being quote-unquote sticky, which is interesting. We can get to that. But also gives us much more of an understanding of who he is as a person and what his background is like. And one of the things I've been pointing out on various podcasts and interviews and whatnot is how we can't separate someone's stage of consciousness from their ability to interpret a certain experience. It's always going to be grounded into that particular interpretive grid. This is also true of individual people and their life stories. So it's important to know his life story because that helps us understand perhaps how that might frame how he might interpret some of these ambiguous points of data. So that's something I took away from this. Happy to get into this book, but let me ask you what your initial impressions were after so much time waiting for this to come out.
Yeah, I really enjoyed the book. I thought it was well written. I thought it was very personal. It gave a very compelling story about who is Lue Elizondo, where he came from, what his motivations are, kind of his guiding principles. It humanized him a good bit. And this is coming from someone, I've been involved in this space pretty actively now for several years and podcasting about it. I've interviewed Lue Elizondo, and I felt that this really did add that extra kind of contour texture to his persona that for me at least was missing to some degree. I feel like I got a good sense of kind of who he is or who he sees himself as. And like you said, I think that's very important that we understand that we all have these interpretive frameworks and grids that we're working with to kind of situate our life experience in a narrative framework. And he certainly is doing that in this book, putting his best foot forward. In other words, I think talking about how he got engaged on this and how he decided ultimately to kind of break rank with the Pentagon and push this out into the public sphere. And, for that, we owe him an incredible debt of gratitude. Here's someone who gave up a GS-15 salary in perpetuity, a home, a regular kind of quality of life that he had, and decided to just roll the dice essentially and say, well, let me hitch my wagon to this Tom DeLonge to the Stars Academy situation, and maybe it'll turn out to be something really great. We'll not only shed some light on, things that I think, as Lue Elizondo thinks that might be some corruption happening in the government, and also one of the greatest secrets that might be held from humankind. But maybe I'll, continue to be able to have a good life in the process. And I'm sure he was, not expecting to have, a lucrative life in ufology. But, how much could he have really known in those early days when he basically went directly from working at the Pentagon to then coming out on that stage with Tom DeLonge? I think the argument that a lot of people put out in social media that he's in this for the money and that kind of thing, I think it's pretty preposterous. I think just do the math, do the math on how much the guy has basically said no to by leaving that government salary behind, the benefits, all the things that go with it, to take on this, and the hopes that it just might eventually one day perhaps lead to a big payoff that would outweigh what he gave up. I find that very, very hard to believe. So I enjoyed the book. There's a lot I want to get into as we're going to talk about it in more detail. And I think it kind of made a big splash. I was looking for it to be an impactful book, and I think it is. I think it is in its own right.
Good points. And I do want to spend some time, as I know you do too, unpacking the book because we want to make sure we give it a fair treatment. I just want to underline what you said. I completely agree that it was definitely a selfless task that he took on. And I am absolutely hats off to him in that regard. I don't doubt for a second his goals in doing that, his motivations, his intentions. I get the sense that, not just from the book, but from interviews he's done more recently, that government corruption is a major concern of his. And on this most recent interview, he talked about even having a recent conversation with his father, who's now passed away, and just his father cautioning that that is the slippery slope towards totalitarianism. Even if you have a government, as Lue pointed out, that is so well-funded that it can absorb corruption, nevertheless, that opens up the opportunity that one day it just slides into totalitarianism. And that is a concern. And I absolutely believe that that was a major motivation for why he came out and why he did what he did. And again, absolutely hats off to him in that regard. It was also interesting hearing about how he got roped into this. I'm curious to hear your take as well. When he suddenly had these visitors show up wondering, what he had done wrong, quote unquote. But then he realized he was being vetted basically for this position, handling security for a platform that was looking into UAP. And then he talks about conversation with James Lakatsky, where he's basically challenged on his worldview and his open-mindedness. And when he's asked, what do you think about UFOs? And he says, I don't. And then Lakatsky kind of jumps and says, you're saying you don't believe in them? He's like saying, no, I just don't have time to think about it. I don't have that luxury. I tend to think about national security and those things. And that'll play into, by the way, what we want to talk about later today in terms of threat versus not threat narratives. But it was interesting to see how he got roped into it, how he was presented with data that eventually made him realize there is a there's something going on here. And I'm sure it's been, in reflection, somewhat frustrating to him to constantly have to answer this question, could it be the Russians, could it be the Chinese, right? Now, on the one hand, you can never say, I know with 100% certainty it is not those platforms, because we just can't go through the process of elimination. We can't go up to the Chinese and the Russians and say, would you mind exposing all of your top secret technology so we can just confirm for everybody's sake that this is not your technology? They're not going to do that, clearly. There's always the possibility that, this could be some deeply black platform that even someone like Lue Elizondo and James Lakatsky didn't get their hands on. This is somewhat is rumored around too. The bottom line is he has to constantly face this question, could it be a foreign adversary, blah, blah, blah. He frequently has to say, we're 99% sure it's not one of those things. So that's interesting too. And just reading about his transition from not just being someone who didn't really think about this issue to being convinced there was something here, but then what was really compelling, and again, this speaks to his character and the kind of his personality, is he was wondering, why are we not doing something about this? Like, once he was convinced there was a there, and he's always been about national security, and these objects, these vehicles are appearing over our most sensitive nuclear facilities and whatnot, and we're just ignoring it, and if anything, saying, well, they're not doing anything bad right now, so let's just not talk about it. Maybe because deep down, there's this awareness that what could we do if we even tried to do something about it? But from his point of view, just ignoring it, to use the analogy you brought up before that he likes to use about fruit that's in the fridge and slowly decomposing over time, doesn't smell any better over time. So that was fascinating to me to see, actually walking through the process he went through to realizing it was real, and then being really frustrated by, almost like bewildered by our national government's response to the matter.
Yeah, you bring up some good points. I think people who are skeptical really struggle with this reality that he's representing, and will levy a complaint about this and say, well, here's just a guy who just naively kind of bought hook, line, and sinker some of these grand tales from the folks like Robert Bigelow and Hal Puthoff and Jay Stratton and, all these other folks connected with Skinwalker Ranch and that kind of thing. And he kind of just stumbled into this program and they showed him some things, and all of a sudden now he just became convinced that, UFOs are a real deal, and he bought into this fantasy, right? And I find that very hard to believe. We're talking about a career intelligence officer who has had to look at countless amounts of intelligence from all kinds of different sources, evaluate the veracity of that intelligence, then report to other people and put your name behind that assessment and say, I've looked at this, I've asked the following sources, I've done my homework to say this is or isn't a threat. This is or isn't a concern. This is or isn't real. And for him to just sort of kind of buy into some fun time stories about a haunted ranch, and then want to take those things to higher ups within the departments and say, this is in fact a real thing. I just got told this by Robert Bigelow, and the guy's got lots of money, so we got to take this seriously. I think is just completely outlandish and really undermines the professional career that he had within the intelligence community. This is a guy who's got many, many years, way before UFOs, proving that he was really good at what he did. And he got promoted as a result of that and gained a reputation as a result of that. Why else would they have gone to this individual to begin with? Oh, well, they went to him because he was a gullible, sort of person they could just rope into the story. And I find that to be such a kind of patronizing perspective on Lue Elizondo and the career that he has developed. And so I appreciated the fact that he kind of brought you in a way, like if you're new to this topic as well, you're going to go through the same series of questions that he raises in the book. I don't think about UAPs. I don't, I'm not concerned about them. I haven't really thought about them, whether they're real or not. It's not even a concern of mine. I've got bills to pay. I've got kids to take care of. This is not on my radar. And then being told by people with the pedigree of James Lukatsky that, maybe you should keep an open mind and this is in fact real. And, I'm a top level government scientist and I look at all kinds of data, to then you can see like in the pages of the book, it really kind of dawning on him the reality of the situation. And once you've gotten that reality, then I think he's doing exactly what we would want one of our, highest kind of patriotic intelligence community members to do, and that is to raise the concern about these craft, these objects, whatever, and what they might be doing, what they might represent. He certainly grew up during the years of 9/11 and the intelligence community failure that led to 9/11, and that's really fresh in his mind, and I'm sure is fresh in the minds of a lot of his colleagues who went through that same time period in the Pentagon, and basically saying, I don't want us to go through this again. I don't know if this is that. I don't know if UFOs, UAP represent the same thing as a 9/11, but we really should look into it. What if it does? Like, what if it happens and we really then have to tell the American people, yeah, well, we knew about this stuff, but we didn't do anything about it, and sorry, right? I think that's not good enough from his point of view, and he decided to fully commit to this path that he's on. So it's an interesting take, and he's been very, very doggedly committed to his decision to not only bring this out in the public, but just kind of continue to beat the drum, both publicly and privately, to raise awareness about what this is and the reality of UAP.
Absolutely. And again, I find myself wanting to, highlight again the sacrifices he has made, because there are some things that people might quibble about, but there are some things that are clear. And to the point you made, this is a guy who had a cushy salary with benefits, was on track to dismounting with a nice retirement savings and whatnot, and a pension not that far in the future if you just sort of see it out. You have to ask yourself, how many people would do what he did when they realized it would directly impact their lives and their children? And props to his wife as well, who was willing to go along with that when he said, this is something I feel I need to do, but it has to be a family decision. And she supported him. And sure enough, when he reflects on what ended up happening, it has been pretty catastrophic for his life. And again, I'm not saying people can't have some questions about some of the claims, but I don't think you can deny that. This is a person who definitely has sacrificed a lot for what he believed was doing the right thing. And he was willing to personally sacrifice for the sake of his country, which of course is what the definition of a patriot is. He definitely was willing to do that. That's a term that gets thrown around fast and loose these days, but not very often do people back it up with actual action. He definitely did do that, and I think deserves that moniker because of it. And then, of course, it was really interesting to hear about the transition into TTSA, because we didn't know some of that. That was some new information there. And you can feel for him in that one part of the book. By the way, some spoilers here, people, but, it's been a while. We're thinking most of you have read it by now, but if you need to turn it off until you've read the book, do so accordingly. But there's this one point where he gets roped into TTSA, which was, I'm sure, interesting for his family because his daughters were apparently fans of Tom DeLonge. And when he first told his wife, she's like, oh, you're going to be a roadie? Because she didn't realize what Tom was doing, right? He's like, no, it's this thing about UFOs and entertainment, and it's wrapped up in research and trying to spread information, but through fiction, right? So you can have plausible deniability. So then he gets roped in. He learns that part of the job description is he has to move to California. So again, his wife's willing. They pick up their kids, in schools, but they move them across to Southern California near San Diego. And then at one point feels like, wow, we're really all in here. Gives Tom a call, Tom DeLonge, and says, hey, we're making some big commitments here. Just want to make sure my salary's secure. Tom's like, absolutely, 100% secure. And then not that long after, he gets another call and says, sorry to tell you this, but we have to cut your salary in half. Right? So he went from this cushy job, well-paying job, in the Washington, D.C. area to now taking on this job in the private sector and actually having his salary cut within a certain period of time. He clearly doesn't really blame Tom. He thinks that Tom, was trying to work with board members and whatnot, and they have shareholders they have to please and whatnot. So it's not something probably Tom wanted to do, but had to happen. And then, of course, even beyond that, he finds out not that long after that actually, unfortunately, the whole thing is shutting down. TTSA is not going to basically go into non-existence, but they're going to turn into a much more of a smaller version of kind of an entertainment arm, mainly is what they're doing with some research. But basically, I think everything that Tom was hoping TTSA would become in terms of this delivery mechanism into the public of what this represents didn't really happen the way he thought it would. So it was interesting to see that. And again, you really feel for him in terms of the sacrifices that were made and that those sacrifices didn't really pan out into these things he was hoping they would. And to, again, underlying the issue around corruption and whatnot, it's also clear from some of the examples in the book that there's times where he gets to a certain level where they're like, you now get to take a private jet on the public's dime, right? And he refuses sometimes and says, I would rather sit in the back of, a transport than do that because that feels wrong to me. It feels icky. It feels like we're not using taxpayer funds the way that we should, not honoring that sacrifice that Americans make in funding these kind of programs. That I really appreciated, right? And he also ran into people doing favors for people, right? So all these things we kind of hope isn't happening, he kind of exposes that it is happening. And he was repulsive to him. I think that's not an exaggeration. That's how he felt about it. So that's already his background, right? And he has a father who fought Castro, who was all about doing the right thing. Now, whether or not you agree with his convictions, that's one thing, but clearly someone committed to whatever they did believe. And so then when he sees this happening in his own government, and then he comes across this program where this is being studied, and on the one hand, he runs into religious fundamentalists who try to bury it for dogmatic reasons, and he knows that is preposterous. And number two, even the ones that are not rejecting it for those reasons, just because it has implications for even the authorities of governments, they would just choose to look the other way. And he knows both of those are completely inappropriate, unacceptable, and he takes up this cause to basically expose this to the American people at a significant loss for his own personal life and the life of his family. So that, I think, before we move into a couple other pieces I want to get into about personal experiences he shared. But to me, I think we really need to underline that because to the point you made earlier, there are skeptics and cynics who paint this like a lot of people in ufology are just trying to make it rich with this, which I'm not really aware of anybody that happens for, number one. And I think also they're just trying to find some way to explain away what clearly is someone acting on conscience, which is what he did here.
Yeah, I want to, at the risk of reaction I might receive, I want to try and sort of walk that tightrope a little bit here and get us thinking about the complexities of the man, right? So we've done a great job here, I think, applauding the work that he's done, and we all owe him a debt of gratitude for what he's done for this topic. And I firmly believe that. And I'm grateful for this book and grateful for his appearances on, network media. The guy is really well-spoken, does really well in interviews. I think is a great spokesperson for this cause. But I want to remind folks, this is a human being, right? This is a human being just like you and I. And, is he perfect? No. And he's said that many times. I get frustrated because I feel as if the UFO community, in a way, has not even taken him at his own word. That they've not allowed him to have the complexity of a human experience, a human life that he's even asking for. And he's saying, like, don't put me on a pedestal. He said during the Kurt Jai-Mongol interview, he doesn't even want to be around, as the spokesperson for this topic in a few years. He'd rather somebody else take up the mantle, rather disappear and kind of grow a long beard and whatever. I mean, this guy is not someone that is, I think, truly seeking the limelight at the end of the day. I think he is trying to complete his mission. And in the service of completing that mission, sometimes, you can imagine this is very plausible. Sometimes people may make decisions that later on they might regret, or they might make decisions that when analyzed under a microscope, we might go, I don't know about that. That seems like a little bit of an overstatement, or that seems like a little bit of a stretch. But, again, in service of a greater mission. And if you've known someone that has served in the military and you've really got to know them well and learned, their commitment to the country, commitment to the service, when they talk about the mission that they have received and how committed they are to seeing that mission be completed, you, I think, have a better understanding of sort of the personality that is working within that framework. And you're going to give them a little bit of latitude, because that commitment to the mission is something that maybe most of us aren't even well equipped to do. We might not have the kind of character or the kind of, discipline, all these things that it would take to get to that finish line, because we might just, I don't know, want to bail at any time. This is getting difficult and I don't want to do it anymore. And, here I see a person that's got their eyes on that particular goal, and they're devoting all of their time, energy, and resources to trying to get there. And, do I think he's probably done some things that, he regrets? Absolutely. Who hasn't done those things that they regret? If you lived long enough, you're going to regret doing some things in life. And I just want to say all that because I feel like we need to bring Lue Elizondo, the man, the person, back into the conversation and move away from Lue Elizondo, the, sort of saint of ufology that he's unfortunately been portrayed as. You can praise and laud everything that he's done and celebrate those accomplishments and be proud of them, and also recognize that he's a flawed person just like the rest of us, and it's okay to have both of those perspectives. You're not denigrating him, and if you're listening to him, he's even telling you that's what he would prefer, to not be placed on that pedestal. So I'll get off my soapbox on that one.
No, I completely agree. And you and I have talked about this privately. And, even without having to say someone's flawed or not, it's just part of being human that you're going to have a certain interpretive grid that you use to make sense of the world. Everyone has it. And to not acknowledge and account for how that particular grid might skew or at least frame, color, how this information is being provided is to miss a major component for anyone that we would encounter, kind of thing. But I completely agree with your point as well, that he basically has tried to say these things about himself. And, he basically said in some interviews, I kind of consider myself kind of a blue-collar kind of guy. And yet, in ufology, we see people hoping that he'll give us some clues about really advanced theoretical physics that has to do with this phenomenon. And you have to ask yourself, is he the right guy to do that? There was some criticism that came out, you might have heard about, around this certain kind of language that's used to describe some of these equations, like Hertz is used at one point, when that's the wrong term in that particular context. Some people have even said, that undermines this entire argument because it just looks like a lack of quality. Where's the editorial aspect here? Did the publisher not check these kinds of things? But again, I think that's mainly the detractors trying to find things that they can shoot down to try to undermine the entire argument. But it does remind us that he's a human being who sometimes is talking about things that, is not his specialty. When he's deferring to what Hal Puthoff is saying, he's not only saying Hal's the guy who figured it out, but he's also saying, I'm not the guy that even understands that equation, other than at the end of the day, Hal checks off the 5 observables and says each of these is possible, in fact expected if you have this one technological innovation, And the point being that we understand this theoretically now. Now it's a question of engineering. Can we engineer this? So that's one of the interesting pieces in the book, by the way, is that, and he kind of hinted at this in interviews years ago that I remember we talked about in some of the first Liminal Phrames episodes, was that now we understand, rather than being flummoxed by these really bizarre technologies and these performance capabilities that we don't understand, now we understand if you have this one aspect where you have gravity manipulation, basically, if you have that, then all of these other things are possible. In fact, you would expect them. Even some of the detractors who say, why are the images always blurry, blah, blah, blah. Well, he's saying you would actually expect that if you have a distortion in space-time between the local space-time bubble that the object is within and what we see looking through that bubble to the object. We're going to see some of these things. He even goes into talking about how they might be manipulating time, and then to us, who has to observe it from our space-time perspective, it's going to look like it's going insanely fast, these right-angle turns that should crush the occupants. But again, the revelation being that if they're in their own bubble of gravity, then they're not absorbing those G-forces the way we would in traditional aircraft. So those were some really interesting aspects that came out. Now, something else I want to say, too, that you brought up before is 9/11, right? And how he brings up how he thinks about the intelligence failure, which he thinks is inexcusable. He looks at it like these different agencies are postured against each other and trying to take credit for things, and it's the CIA against the FBI, against the NSA and whatnot. And as we know, the Department of Homeland Security was formed to try to bring these under one umbrella, basically, so we wouldn't have that intelligence failure, because what he's basically saying is we had enough information to perhaps prevent 9/11, but a lack of communication amongst the agencies was the fatal flaw there. And he, as you pointed to, his concern now is that by this excessive siloing of this topic, and in addition to the fact that nobody really wants to talk about it publicly and even really take it seriously, it might present the same kind of scenario in the future. Now, we're going to get into whether or not an invasion scenario is very realistic, but that's at least the argument he's making. But I want to make another point about this 9/11 piece, because I'm sure you remember where you were when 9/11 happened. I certainly remember. I think every one of us in our generation remembers where we were. And I remember it being such a shocking event, partly because for the first time, we were kind of like seeing these images of these jets flying into the buildings over and over and over again, like constantly on repeat, and then the buildings collapsing. And it was a massive shock to the collective, right? Both individually and collective, even to the point where we were willing to sign off all sorts of our civilian rights under the Patriot Act, right? Because we were in such a fear state. This is relevant here, I think, because this is what I see happening in ufology to some degree, is as people become aware of what is going on here, that there are these non-human intelligences in our midst that are demonstrating remarkable capabilities that far outpace anything we can do. People immediately go to that kind of fear state. And I could imagine a scenario where it could be positioned by certain people in power that this is a major threat. Please sign off another $1 trillion towards, the DOD, or just look the other way while we don't pass audit time and time and time again, because it's going to these deeply black projects. Just trust us. It's for our protection against this huge threat that is emerging kind of thing. So what I'm pointing to there is not that 9/11 didn't happen. Of course it did. But then it became this thing that was so overblown, right? And I think about even how today we take our shoes off and everything every time we fly. Like when I flew to Houston last week, I was thinking about that, all because of this one event, right? And you notice how when these traumatic things happen, we sometimes overreact and we kind of pendulum swing. So I think about that too. My concern is that even in the book, I'll be honest, when certain events are portrayed more heavily than others in that book, it can tend to paint a picture where these others seem more nefarious or more malevolent than they really are in the total picture when you really understand experiencer history and whatnot and cases across the board. That is somewhat concerning for me. But before we leave the book specifically and talk about how much impact we think is happening, how much it's moving the needle beyond ufology, I just want to touch on another couple of pieces that are interesting. I'm sure you found it interesting too. One being the fact that, as if we didn't already have the issue of this trying to gain traction in the mainstream, but on top of that, he starts talking about remote viewing in this book, which is psi, right? Which is something else that the average detractor, the average person that is living under the rubric of scientific materialism is going to reject, right? Not only did he talk about remote viewing, but he mentions that he was actually part of a program, that he basically was tested. He did pretty well. He describes kind of like going into this state where he kind of dials this invisible dial and then sees what images kind of come to his mind, and that basically he was roped into a program, and then soon after that the program was disbanded, so he didn't get to do much of it. But it kind of hinted at not only that there are aspects of reality that we already don't understand, let alone thinking about the UFOs, but that somehow maybe this is all connected. And of course, one of the interesting things I've been talking about on recent podcasts is how different ethnic backgrounds seem to be connected to certain capabilities, right? So I think Lue has some Cherokee in his background and that kind of thing, and that plays into this very interestingly. And of course, the other one, I'd love to get your take on when you read about the orbs in his home, these diffused, without a hard outline, these green orbs that would appear in a hallway and move down the hallway. He pointed out in a couple of interviews that he couldn't really install cameras because it was unknown when they would appear, where they would appear, but everybody noticed it. He might not even have, noted it, except that his wife saw it, his kids saw it, which goes to what I mentioned earlier with the stickiness of this platform, which Lakatsky was referring to, which is speaking to the hitchhiker phenomenon, which, interestingly, we learned in the book, I think, for the first time, that Jay Stratton was apparently the person that coined that term, basically to describe the fact that even studying this is likely to make it that it will end up showing up in your own life in certain ways. And clearly, Lakatsky and others had experienced this personally already and were basically warning Lue, but in a pretty cryptic way that he didn't really understand until he saw it happening. But, of course, this raises such interesting questions because it's one thing to talk about technological objects, vehicles that are hard and solid objects that we can study, right? And weird things like orbs appearing in his house afterwards and to other people too. These things stretch into the quasi-physical and even the mental aspects and seem tied to people. And we talk about this social contagion piece, right? Fascinating. I think while on the one hand, just like with Skinwalkers at the Pentagon, do you remember the reception of that book, right? People laughed at it and said, listen, it's one thing to study UFOs, technological craft from Alpha Centauri, but you're now talking about weird creatures like wolfmen standing against light poles, smoking cigarettes and whatnot. What on earth does this have to do with this? We've got, the detractors that are probably under the payroll of some agencies saying things like this is wacky and spooky stuff, therefore you should dismiss the whole thing. So I can see how some people would make the argument, we should just stick to the nuts and bolts. We sometimes hear this said right in our community because that's where we're going to get traction in the mainstream. And yet if you're someone who's trying to do an objective job of presenting the data as it presents itself, these things are all wrapped up together. So what did you think about that in terms of not just hearing that experience of his, but how that affects moving the needle in the mainstream?
Well, remote viewing was long speculated to be part of Lue Elizondo's experience, but he never publicly acknowledged that he had done it or even continued to do it. And so I honestly, Darren, I was a little bit surprised that he even went that far in this book and spoke so openly about that experience. And it only makes his connection to this more fascinating to me because here you have an individual who went through some remote viewing training and apparently developed some skill in that. And I recognize some people still think that it's not a real thing, but I feel like I'm in the camp that there's something to it. And clearly the government felt so because they devoted some resources to this as well. So he became, fairly good at this and used it on numerous occasions to, provide intelligence and whatnot. So you've got a person with that kind of experience who, on the other hand, has never really contemplated other strange things like UFO, UAP. Think about that conversation he had with Dr. Lakatsky, right? So I wonder the kind of personal journey that Lue went through, beginning to reconcile all of these strange things into one larger framework, this developing framework that he is probably still working on, how this all connects together. So I was really grateful that he spoke directly to that experience. I know that it also raised some eyebrows because he described an anecdote in the book about where he and some other remote viewers essentially kind of presented themselves to a known terrorist and tried to convert that terrorist to getting onto the straight and narrow path. And apparently, according to him, they had some success with that. There are a lot of folks that take issue with some of these practices, and I can totally understand that perspective. So really, really fascinating. The orb in the house, also quite interesting. Not only that because he described seeing it, but his wife, Jen, described seeing it. His daughters also saw these things. So you've got multiple folks that have seen this phenomena, and I understand the frustration. Well, grab your cell phone and take a photo of this, and well, why didn't you do that? And it's so easy just to do that. People think, well, I would have done it. I'd have a whole video of this thing. Well, I mean, we don't know how long the orbs appeared. When and where they appeared, what time of day they appeared. I get it that maybe some younger folks are always on their phones all the time. That maybe Lue Elizondo's not that guy. Maybe he's not, glued to his phone when he comes home. He probably wants to just unwind and not think about that stuff. So, there are a whole host of reasons why he might not have evidence for this. I would love to see it myself. But, the funny thing about that, we get a lot of cries for, photos, evidence. Oh, but when we get photos, evidence here, I'm thinking a lot of like what Chris Bledsoe has, shared with the world. You get folks that immediately jump on that. Well, that's just, this or that's that, or that's a bokeh effect. Or, it goes on and on. So you really can't win. And, I feel for him in the wake of these revelations in the book, because now he's getting these new questions like, well, why didn't you do this? And why didn't you do that? And where's the proof, Lou? And, how it's just, these are cool stories, these trust me, bro stories. And people are very understandably, there's fatigue about that right now. I get it. But I'm grateful that you've seeded this into the public conversation. And I honestly think, Darren, we're going to see more public conversation about this going forward. If you think about where we are, where we're going, we've come quite a good ways. And it's books like this that help further that conversation, where you went from, we've got videos of UAP, what the F is that thing from a fighter pilot, to now we're able to discuss things like remote viewing in a public conversation, orbs in the house, and even, quite frankly, abductions and implants, which he talks to in the book as well. So these are all topics that, the insiders have essentially decided, we don't want to bring these things up yet. The public's not ready for that conversation. Let's get folks to buy into the reality of these objects first. Then we're going to talk about this other, content material. Well, we're talking about that material now, and we're talking about it publicly. So I think if we're going to ask the question, has this moved the needle, and will it? Absolutely, it is. It is happening, and you're seeing that. You're seeing the stigma being reduced. And I think that only naturally will lead to more individuals with direct experience being comfortable coming forward and sharing that experience with the rest of the world.
Yeah, agreed. And several other things come to mind as I was listening to you there. One is around these orbs. Again, what's interesting is juxtaposing that with implants, because this is part of the perplexing nature of this phenomenon. Because implants seem like, okay, that I understand, nuts and bolts, you want to track people, you put an implant up their nose, and you have your little radar situation up on your craft, and you can follow them around the planet, right? But then you have this other aspect where these guys, just because they're in this program, end up seeing orbs, right? Or end up seeing weird creatures, shadow figures, sometimes people that they even haven't specifically been in the program, but they somehow know a person who's in the program. So a cousin or a neighbor ends up seeing these phenomena just because they're socially somehow connected to the person, even if they haven't even had a conversation about the work they do. So this raises really fascinating questions about the nature of reality again. So as the second we try to reduce this to a conversation about one additional layer we want to add to our reality scape, this constantly confounds that process. And of course, this thing about the orbs, is at the very heart of this phenomena, because Kenneth Arnold, we learned in recent years, actually not only was this person who gave birth to the modern UFO phenomenon with his reports of what he saw in the Pacific Northwest, but these craft flying in formation, doing things that craft that he knew about shouldn't be able to do. But on top of that, he had orbs appear in his house in the days and weeks to follow after the sighting. And of course, that prompts the question, why? How is that connected? Right? So these are fascinating aspects that seem to be almost in opposition with each other. We hear about implants. Again, that sounds like, sure enough, technological devices. Are they sophisticated? Absolutely, because he talks about them having this kind of biological coding so that your body doesn't reject them like it would like a foreign transplant kind of thing. So he talks about human beings when they get a new heart or a new lung or something, they have to take medication to fight off the body's natural ability to fight any kind of foreign object that it recognizes by DNA, right? So this is a sophisticated defense mechanism that the body has that we still have not figured out how to master. So we have to basically use these drugs to fight back this immune response. And yet these things, while technological, right? He says he doesn't want to quite call it a chip, but it's something technological, a piece of metal that is surrounded by this biological material that coats it in such a way that the body doesn't recognize it as a foreign body. And then on top of that, most fascinatingly perhaps, is the point he makes that when doctors try to retrieve these objects, they move. And that implies that they have their own metabolism, is something he's been talking about, right? That somehow under their own power, they are moving around. And this raises questions, again, about this line between technology and biology. Fascinating in itself. All right. So we've talked about what's in the book. Let's just spend a few minutes talking about the impact. You said that you think it is going to move the needle. You think that it's really already having an impact. I think that's true when you see him on these major news networks, right? Not just News Nation and the usual players, but actually CBS, NBC, CNN, these kind of things that are running stories as well. You get the sense that it is moving the needle. And to his credit, both in terms of being fair to the data and also helping to have the mainstream metabolize this, he makes the point many times, we do not know this is space aliens. He makes this point repeatedly. We don't know what they are. That's partly what comes next, is that kind of research. His point is that if we don't turn this information over to the scientific community, how are we going to make any headway here? We're not going to make any headway when it's siloed away in these different deeply black programs. So that's been fascinating to watch when people kind of on default rewinding X-Files episodes in their minds, ask him, so are you saying these are space aliens? He's like, I don't know what they are. I mean, they might be. They may have been here all along, right? And even if they originally had an origin, as we've talked about many times in this podcast, in Zeta Reticuli or Alpha Centauri, if they've been here for tens of thousands of years, then what are they? Do we have the right terms to describe them? Even people like, my colleague and friend Jeff Kripal have talked about this is wrapped up in religious lore and history, and you and I have talked about that and done episodes on it. So it's fascinating where it goes from here because, as I like to say, this is the one topic that leaves no other topic unscathed. Where will we go from here? I guess that's the next question. How much will this seed the next round of inquiry in terms of congressional involvement, in terms of the mainstream media finally getting engaged? What is your read on that when you look at what you see coming next?
Yeah, it's a great question. We've talked before about how this year in particular is a bit of a dicey year for forward momentum on the topic because it is an election year in the United States. We do have the UAPDA legislative language that is going to be a possibility of passing this year. But will it, is the political will there given all the things that are going on? I just don't know. And I think it's clear to me that in the public conversation, in the water cooler conversation, we're at least much more open to talking about these things than we ever have been before as a society. And I gauge that, I make that statement just by looking at how the anchors respond to Lue Elizondo when they're interviewing him. And you're getting responses like, I knew that was true. I always knew that was the case. Or, I'm really fascinated by this and I hope we have you back and we learn more about this. You're not getting the same kinds of, weird chuckles or nervous laughter that they don't really, they're kind of frustrated they even have to interview this guy. They're kind of in a way wishing they had more time to talk to him. So I think that is a good sign that the public is hungry or open to having this conversation in a way that it hasn't had before. The ambiguity about what it actually is really, I think, a challenge to moving it forward to a certain degree, because it does make a serious conversation that much more challenging, because everyone's bringing so much baggage to UFOs, right? We've got so much baggage along, packed up with this issue, and that if you're telling me that it's going to require us to be, thinking more critically or in a complex way, that it might not just be aliens from another place, and it could be they're here all along, interdimensional, and all these kinds of other things. Like these are avenues of thought that the general public hasn't actually nurtured in any shape, way, or form. They've only strongly considered this one possibility. And so that makes moving this into a broad conversation, into I think a better conversation, makes that very challenging. But I think, if you consider that and think about the angle that Elizondo and Chris Mellon have chosen to pursue in pushing this forward, both in a public stance, but also, privately in Congress, kind of getting legislators on board, it makes so much more sense that they're packaging this and framing this entire thing from the standpoint of that kind of threat narrative. And I know we're really going to get into some nuance on that, but I see that very, very clearly. Imminent, this book, makes that very clear, that this is the decision they made, that they're going to pursue this framework in particular because it's the best chance of getting this conversation out into the public. Now, it's clear to me as well, they don't think it's that exclusively. They don't think it's just a threat, only a threat, and that it, in fact, is one singular thing. But this is the framework that they've picked to really move the ball forward. And I think, honestly, it's the right one. So what do you think about that, Darren? What's your perspective on that?
Yeah, I agree on that we need to be able to separate different elements in this conversation. The first one is that Lue and Chris are long-term employees of the national government in various forms. They are very familiar with how to make this work, how to behoove Congress and our different representatives to become involved. And Lue in the book discusses conversations he had with Chris Mellon, where Chris Mellon says, just, we're not going in, we're not lobbyists, right? So he's basically positioning Lue, saying, we're going in, we've got information they want. We've now seeded this into the public spectrum, and they are hearing things from people who want to know more, their constituents and whatnot. We're going in with information. We are here to provide a service. We are not trying to lobby. We are not lobbyists, right? He makes this point. So Chris clearly has a very nuanced way of imagining how to move the ball forward here. But you make a great point that the nature of the unknown aspect of the origin and the nature of these beings and how many beings there might be from different origin sources is actually a difficulty in terms of landing this in the mainstream, because people are not convinced that they're there unless we know those things. But of course, we don't know those things because we haven't studied it, or perhaps because we don't have the capacity to fully understand it yet. We might not have a map that is adequate. But this is what's so fascinating about this moment, is that we have had no other topic like this in the history of our nation or our lifetimes and whatnot, where we want to study something that there are so few knowns, things that we can say for sure we know about it. Now, to your point about the sort of realpolitik aspect, absolutely. I think that their understanding was that you have to at least position this as a potential threat, because then Congress has to respond from their constitutional obligations to respond and to investigate. And of course, when you also imply and sometimes outright state that you think there's massive corruption within the DOD, and even a historic campaign that someone like David Grush spoke to even more pointedly, of willingly deceiving the public, a massive campaign to deceive the public. People like Leslie Kean have talked about her hearing about from whistleblowers that the amount of money they spend on just protecting and hiding the program is a higher number than they spend on the actual research within the program. So this just goes to show how much this has been kept out of the public light. And these are the kind of things that Chris and Lue are raising to try to get Congress to say, listen, something's going on that's nefarious within our own government, let alone the nature of these beings. We've got to get to the bottom of this. Of course, it occurs to me this is tricky because if there have been accords made, not just with the quote-unquote U.S. government, which of course is a complex amalgam of different agencies and whatnot, but even within certain armed services branches, for instance, like the Air Force might have a different accord than the Navy or one particular element of the Air Force. We again think about some of the things we've heard before, about these nefarious kind of agreements, even where they are knowingly saying okay to abductions of citizens in exchange for technology and those kinds of things. Fascinating. Of course, we can understand why they would not want to get this out. And this is something I want to address too before we move into the threat versus non-threat narrative kind of thing, is that it's clear to me there's a push and pull going on, that there are some factions that really do want this out, and someone like Lue Elizondo is clearly championing that, as is Chris Mellon. We have heard about some, how do we want to say this, some tensions between certain of these major players that are often raised in this conversation. Everybody knows the main names. I don't need to say them. We have heard about some tensions between these different people. And I think this speaks to not just differences of opinion in terms of personality clashes, but even within some of those inner circles, there are differences of opinion about what disclosure should look like. Some people are all for, let's release it now, let it out there. The fruit is rotting in the fridge, it's time to let it out. Others have more of a conditional perspective, where they see this as being complex. They see this as something that will inevitably highly impact our civilization because, as I hinted before, it's the one topic that leaves no other topic unscathed. Therefore, there are numerous sectors in our society that will be simultaneously impacted if you just dump this, right? So from their perspective, it's not that they're against disclosure wholesale, but they are against just dumping it without at least giving some thought to how do you roll this out that causes the least amount of stress in the system. These are important questions, and I think this is going to be fascinating to see this walk out as we go from here. I totally agree with you that this is moving the needle. It has moved the needle. And I think that if it's true that whistleblowers are coming later this year, that these 2 documentaries are coming out later this year, we will continue to see momentum build. And then if we can get past this major moment in history, which is this next election, only 7-8 weeks away now, then I think it's going to be a really, really interesting close to the year.
Yeah, we're, buckle up, right, as they say. Certainly some interesting things on the horizon materializing. These seem to be materializing. So we want to get into some of the nuance, though, on this threat, non-threat component. And a lot of folks, I think understandably so, take an issue with how strongly the threat narrative has been pushed forward by Lue and Chris. And if you just take a look at the table of contents on Imminent, you see a lot of words that will jump out at you, things like, warrior, and, he's talking about angels and demons. He's talking about Kalares. That's the second chapter in the book, which, maybe we should talk a little bit about that. Chapter 23 is titled The War Plan. So we have very, militaristic language that is used in this book. And honestly, that's exactly what I would expect to see. This is where I think people, for whatever reason, I don't know, they just forget the fact that when you've got individuals who have been trained, many, many, many hours, whole careers in looking at situations from a military perspective, is this a threat? Is this not a threat? How do I engage with whatever this might be and come up with a plan if XYZ happens in that engagement? That's, a military mindset. And if you are a nation state that is trying to protect its citizens against, nefarious actors that don't have the best intentions that aren't for your people, you need these people. You need folks with a military mindset. They keep you safe. But I would liken that to being a hammer, and to a hammer, everything looks like a nail. You've probably heard that saying before. And I think that's exactly what we're seeing take place from the individuals who have come forward from the government talking about the UAP, UFO phenomena. Think about it, right? Every major whistleblower, insider, if the government, has this stuff, they have come from this governmental military background framework of understanding. And all the documents that they've reviewed related to that phenomena, all the programs that they've reviewed related to all of those things are functioning within that larger framework as well. And so it's natural and expected that the narrative they're going to be most comfortable pushing, or at least describing, talking about, is one of, is this a threat? And this seems like it could be a threat. And, you add to that you've got these capabilities that we don't seem to possess. They can essentially do whatever they want in our skies. They can get to us with energy weapons. Kalaris is talking a lot about that. They can, orbs can appear in your house without you, knowing about it. They can put implants into you and abduct you. I mean, these are things that, if you're coming from that background, the klaxons are blaring. The warning signs are there. Danger, danger, danger. We need to be prepared for whatever this might be. But that's, again, like one side of this perspective. It's just one avenue of approach to this particular, phenomena, or suite of phenomena. And so I find it interesting that, if you've been invested in this topic, you get frustrated by this. I think it's to be expected. But what I'm hoping to see is that it mature, right? That this conversation will mature. And I think those that are pushing that threat narrative probably also hope that as well, right? At least they're optimistic that it will mature and that their worst fears won't be realized. How much do they actually know? And, is this in fact a legitimate concern? From what I've heard from Lue, which recently is just, this week, he said, taking off his national security hat, he doesn't think this is a threat. So that gives you a little bit of a hint there of, of what his real assessment is on this. But maybe he's an optimist. Maybe he's not really being, fully genuine with that perspective. I don't know. I think it's much more complex. It can't just be reduced to one thing, one actor, one, capability, all those things that people like to do when they want to reduce this down to something easy, to simple sound bites.
Right. And a couple of things come to mind that Lue has said since the book came out in terms of interviews and whatnot. There's one particular interview that I know that you and I discussed privately that was a little surprising to us because it seemed a bit one-dimensional. And it had to do with him responding to the question from Ross Coulthart, about whether or not these beings might be benevolent because significant portions within ufology believe that's the case. And then Lue, seemingly getting a little bit heated, raised certain historical incidents that he thinks if they were benevolent, perhaps they would have intervened, and they didn't, which kind of was implying that therefore that should make us question whether or not they're benevolent. He raised, for instance, when we developed the capacity for nuclear weapons, and when the Soviets did, and when the state of India did, and Pakistan, and he went on, talking about basically how we are in a much more dangerous place as a global civilization now than we were 50, 60 years ago. And he doesn't see any sign that these benevolent actors are intervening. So therefore he perhaps wonders aloud, does that mean that they're the opposite, that they're actually malevolent, that they're actually working against us, or certainly are not willing to do anything to prevent us from destroying ourselves? But I remember I made a post on social media about this because I think we have to really watch for anthropocentric bias in these kinds of situations. And we have to be very careful to recognize that while on the one hand we're saying there's many things we don't understand, and yet we're willing to fill in the blanks when it comes to this analysis about whether or not they're benevolent or malevolent or neutral, because we don't know exactly how they think, number one. And number two, many people from experience or history, and I'm very familiar with this and studied this in depth, will talk about them being more interested in us maturing to the point where we don't destroy ourselves, rather than them coming into some sort of nanny state to babysit us so that we don't do that. And of course, this gets really complex because this gets into situations beyond this lifetime and beyond this one particular quote-unquote physical frame. Questions around souls and the maturation of souls and how civilizations eventually become a collective consciousness when souls kind of unite and get to a certain stage of consciousness. So these are matters that should inform that question around whether or not they're benevolent or malevolent. And I was surprised and a bit disappointed at how one-dimensional that particular part of the conversation was. I would have preferred in that moment for him to say, it's not for me to say, I don't know, and you could paint it both ways or something like that. I also want to bring up or touch on something you brought up, right, with Colaris, because I thought it's, like I pointed to earlier, it's interesting what he did mention historically in terms of cases and what he didn't. And again, knowing that a lot of people reading this book are not going to be familiar with the history, my concern is that frames it a certain way and ends up skewing it, unfortunately. So he could have brought up, for instance, the Ariel School incident in Zimbabwe. And that, of course, paints a very different picture because we have beings that land peacefully and communicate their intentions, their concerns to school children about us being too technologically focused, about us losing the sense of connection with our deeper selves, and major concerns about the future and ecological collapse. Things that have all come true, you could argue, that those are basically proclamations, prophetic proclamations that have come true. I think for a new person coming into the topic, like you mentioned your parents, reading about that case would describe a very different scenario than Colaris, right? Furthermore, I'm not saying I know what happened with Colaris, but there have been some people have questioned whether or not that actually is NHI or if that could even be some sort of psyop by the CIA or something. People like Jacques Vallée have historically talked about how the CIA, for instance, one point talked about beaming this giant hologram of Jesus because the largely Christian population would take that as a sign that Jesus was against Castro or something like that. Basically being used as a method to sociologically persuade people around a political matter by using psyops, basically. We know that MyLabs is in this. Of course, he didn't mention that, right? He can't mention everything. But we know that there have been concerns that sometimes elements of the government will parade as aliens in order to accomplish some other kind of task. So what's the possibility that something like Colaris might be that? I'm not saying I know that, but to bring up a case like that in isolation from other cases that paint a very different picture and not talk about things like MyLabs, I think, I'm not saying it's irresponsible, but it inevitably skews the conversation, in some particular ways. So that's something to be aware of, I think. Now, in terms of this threat versus non-threat, so we've already discussed how we completely understand how in them trying to first win the first battle, being how do you get Congress to take this seriously, they employed this matter of you at least have to see it as a potential threat. You have to make Congress aware of, for instance, the history around them showing up around nuclear silos and not just showing up, but sometimes shutting down nuclear silos. Some people like to point out a couple of cases where one's been turned on. I'm aware of situations that are generally not part of the public conversation, where in addition to the actual machines and the technology being shut down, the people operating the buttons that say launch or not have also had their psychic capacities impacted by seeming intervention from these beings. For instance, things like, when they're locking in on a target, like in the Soviet Union, after having all this go offline, just when they're about to enter that target again, something in their mind prevents them from doing it. Now, again, you could argue again that that's a benevolent entity saying, are you sure you want to do this? Do you want to go back to where you were before, where you guys are targeting each other, right? You could wipe out the civilization and the biosphere on top of it. Again, I fully admit, I don't know that, right? People like Robert Salos, who've been a bit critical of Lue's approach here and the way he's framed the nuclear question, from his perspective, he sees it more like a benevolent overarching intelligence trying to draw our attention to what looks like collective insanity from their point of view. I admit we do not know that, but at least I'd like to see that discussed within this overarching conversation. But just to finish my point here, so the first battle is getting Congress to really move on this and to frame it at least as a potential threat and make Congress aware of the nuclear interaction in the history. I completely think that's justified. Then we go to the next question or the next part of the conversation once it's finally landed in Congress and once the American people are fully involved and the world population is what does this mean? Where do we go from here? But another one I want to sort of bring in here in terms of, is this a threat or not? And I want you to be, totally transparent here about what you tend to think about this. Because I do think part of the complexity here is that there's more than one kind of intelligence here that is not human. Of course, even in a recent interview, it's come up that, the reminder that many of these non-conventional beings are often humanoid or fully human. So this is really complex in terms of what they are. But another aspect, of course, is our historic interaction with them, with our military. So we know that there have been interactions with our military going back well into the beginning of the 20th century. Now, when you think about those kinds of interactions and all of the major cases you think of and the way that frames the way you think about the whole thing, where do you land on the behavior that has been displayed by these others in interacting with our military in terms of whether or not you think they are demonstrating themselves as a threat or not?
Yeah, and that's a big question because I say that because it's almost one of those questions where depending on what time of day you catch someone, you might get a different answer. You can very, very easily take the perspective that this is a legitimate threat. If you were, let's take a reductionist perspective to it, that this is not multiple different kinds of phenomena, it's a singular phenomena that's just messing with us in some way or another. If you take that perspective and just look at many of the interactions, the governmental military interaction cases, where you're talking about crash craft or you're talking about body retrieval, you're talking, Colares, another good example, Virginia, where a government came and scooped up something from Brazil. When you're looking at it from that perspective, I think, Tic Tac is a good one too. You can easily see, here we go. We've got some capability testing that's happening by this phenomena. We've got some perhaps Trojan horse material that they've given us, quote unquote, but where are they going to take it to their, super secret military government bases? Isn't that what we want to know more about? Their super secret military bases? We were probing their nuclear capability, their greatest weapons that they could use to defend themselves. The list goes on and on. So if you look at those things from that militaristic training and perspective, I don't see how you can't see that as a threat. It's very, very concerning, very concerning. But as you point out, right, there are these other cases that aren't military interaction cases, that are aerial school, Westall, any kind of many of the personal experience interactions that people have recounted where this isn't the case at all. It doesn't seem like they're, out there to, probe our defenses and that kind of thing. Chris Bledsoe's experience, another good example of this. And so you look at all those and go, okay, it's not a threat at all. We totally misunderstood this. Like, they're absolutely benevolent. Everything's okay. I think these are easy sort of binary, this is like the snack food of ufology. It's like, that's a threat. I'm done. I want to get another high, like give me another threat narrative. Boom. Like that feels right to me. They're all demons, man. And then, or you can be like, well, I like feeling good and I like knowing that everything's going to work out okay. And so give me that hit of love and light and everything's all right. If you work harder at this, though, if you look at this harder, you realize it's just not that simple. It's not, you can't reduce it down to these two things. Just like you can't reduce human behavior down to these two things. How we treat other species, how we treat the planet, how we treat each other. Is it all good? Is it all bad? No, it's incredibly gray. And so I think we have honestly no real clue as to the final answer to that question. Because we just don't know enough about what it is that we're dealing with and who it is we're dealing with. If we're dealing with lots of different kinds of entities, it gets much more complicated. Some might be, more benevolent to us. Those might have people within their, beings within their ranks who aren't benevolent towards us, just like humans would have some benevolent humans and, malevolent humans. So it's a very complicated situation. If you want my personal perspective on it, I think that, there's really no clear answer to this question yet. I think we need to be cautious and we need to do our due diligence. And I think it would be irresponsible of us to not research its capabilities and at least entertain that perspective of it potentially being a threat. But I also think we need to be very considerate of all the other perspectives that our brightest minds can bring to the table, because this is something that clearly is not within the known framework of our reality. And if that's the case, requires a whole different set of tools to getting to closer to understanding what this is.
Right. And there's a couple key elements I'd like to get to before we close out this conversation in the final 15 minutes or so here. First thing I want to say, though, in response to what you just said there, I've made this analogy before of this sort of being like people making absolute statements about the Amazon jungle. Is the Amazon jungle benevolent or is it malevolent? And you realize it's kind of a category error, right? Because there are poisonous snakes, large spiders, things that can kill you in the Amazon. Does that mean the Amazon is malevolent or that you can say one thing about it? No, it's also glorious and colorful and an amazing example of biodiversity, something that's a treasure of the earth. Both those things are true. Just like I've made the argument that when we have a 5-year-old, we don't say, please feel free to roam all across the city. No harm could ever come to you. Nothing but benevolence out there. We know that there's a range, like you were speaking to. And what I've been arguing for all along is a spectrum of consciousness development, that we know that's true of humankind. I've talked about this with spiral dynamics before. We can see predictable stages of consciousness that come online when different criteria are present for a certain people group. It makes complete sense to me, first of all, theoretically, that would apply to these other intelligences too, because ultimately this is all about source consciousness iterating as sentience, basically. But in addition to that, that's kind of what is implied in experiencer lore as well, is that there is a range. Now, that said, I do want to sort of caution people that I think there's a lot of positive elements here. I think that there are elements where they are further along in their stage of consciousness. They are closer to source consciousness, and therefore they are helping. But the way they help, again, is much more standoffish in a way, depending on how you look at it. It is much more about cultivating inner awareness and actual maturing of our population than it is about stopping certain events from happening. And I think while there are some absolutely parasitic entities that can also plague people, I want to come back to what I said before about 9/11. We have to be careful not to foster an environment of fear, because these entities can feed off of that. So you can actually end up creating an environment where fear is becoming the norm because of what's being seeded in the conversation. So the truth is there's a lot of positivity here, while still acknowledging that there are some entities that are parasitic in the same way that there's certain entities that are parasitic for our biological organism. And even there, we wouldn't necessarily say they're evil. They just have a different agenda and they feed off certain things. Some of these kinds of entities do feed off fear states, so we need to be aware of that. So that just adds another layer of complexity to this conversation, realizing that the very plates we put on the table end up impacting what we end up dining on. So it's really interesting. But this is something else I want to bring up, one of two things before we finish today. The first one is we've heard Lue at a couple points talk about, from his perspective, again, to your analogy of the hammer-nail situation. He looks at them coming in, looking at our defenses, seeing if they can turn off nukes, leaving again, showing up at different Air Force bases, seemingly perhaps running some sort of clandestine intelligence gathering effort, then disappearing again to places unknown. He says at times, to him, that looks like an intelligence gathering operation. And he's either said this or people have sort of filled in the blanks that might be something an intelligence would do prior to some sort of invasion. So this has been part of the conversation recently too. But something I don't hear talked about, which is absolutely part of the phenomenological data that we should be pointing to here, is that they can manipulate space-time itself. So if that's the case, does it still make sense that they would run these intelligence gathering operations prior to something like an invasion, the same way that a human force would? Again, I'm concerned about the anthropocentric bias here, because if they can manipulate space-time, which they seem to be able to do, if they can custom craft perceptual experiences for people so that 5 people can not only be impacted in their consciousness and what they think is happening, but you can have 5 different custom crafted perceptual experiences delivered to those people, screen memories and whatnot. You think about those kind of capacities, let alone the fact that they have these technological craft that can behave in ways we can't hope to even catch up with. It's like throwing paper airplanes after an F-18 or something. It's kind of preposterous. So let's get your take on that in terms of sometimes the gap between the kind of questions we ask based on the actual data and what it's telling us about their capacities and what kind of things they would even be interested in even if they were nefarious, right? Even if you want to make that argument for a second, or at least as a potential, would they conduct an affair like that, knowing the kind of capacities they've demonstrated elsewhere?
Yeah, I don't think so. I think I'm more persuaded by the argument here that if they wanted to get rid of us, they could have easily done so a long time ago. There's no need for the cat and mouse. There's no need for, the long, protracted engagements over many, many decades. It's just completely unnecessary. That if they want the planet, they can have it. Anytime that they want it, they could get it. So I'm not persuaded by this, kind of threat invasion component to it. I am more persuaded by, what you've alluded to, that this might be, kind of this opportunity for us to develop both as a civilization and as individuals. I want to point out too that the chronicled engagements that are given greater official weight in this conversation are all coming from military engagements. They're not coming from people like Whitley Strieber, people like Chris Bledsoe, people who have personal experiences throughout their entire life of abduction, of relationship with entities. They're not given the same level of credence and authority as these military encounters. It's much more compelling to hear from a Commander David Fravor than it is to hear from Whitley Strieber. For whatever reason, we've been conditioned to place a higher degree of credibility on David Fravor than on an author. So you've got to factor that into this equation, that we're really getting a very narrow, filtered perspective of what is going on here. Imagine if we were to get the full gamut of experience. I think that's what you and I are really most curious about, is imagine if we were able to collate all of these encounters and experiences at any given time on the planet, and even over protracted periods of time, get all of those experiences from all the different reported entities, and all of the different, collection modalities, get all that information, assess it, then come to a better conclusion about what's going on there. I think that's going to yield a lot more fruit, a lot more progress. Will we ever get to that point? That's the big open question, because as you and I have talked about, and we've mentioned this many times, I'm discouraged by the way the conversation is going in academic circles, because the approach is seemingly reduced to, well, let's just throw more of our academic disciplines at this thing, and then we'll understand it better. And honestly, I'm not quite sure that's the best way we're going to do it. As I mentioned to you before we got onto the show, it would be like coming from the world where people use the Bible as their means of understanding reality, and it's worked out pretty well for them for quite some time. And all of a sudden, they've got some guy who says, "Oh, by the way, I've developed this thing called a microscope, and it's look at these tiny things in there, like they're whole different creatures." And then the powers that be say, "Wonderful. Well, we're just going to use the Bible to understand what these creatures are." Like that sounds absolutely preposterous, and that's exactly what I fear we're doing now. We're using the same means of understanding reality that have worked for us thus far, and applying them to an aspect of reality that we really know absolutely nothing about.
Totally true. And by the way, I had flashbacks as you were talking there to many conversations in my evangelical circles years ago about where are the dinosaurs in the Bible, and if they're not there, did the dinosaurs ever actually exist? But then when someone would say, well, Leviathan must have been a dinosaur, I remember those kind of conversations. Speaking of these maps and trying to apply them as totalities for reality representations. But there's a nice segue here to sort of close with, because you mentioned Whitley Strieber. This is something else that Lue has brought up in passing, and he mentions it very much in passing in the book. And again, my slight frustration, I'm not saying this is intentional on his part, is that by bringing up abductions and the kind of shock value of people are being taken, medical procedures are being conducted without permission being granted, apparently, at a certain level anyway. And in interviews since then, Lue has even gone so far as to say, again, from his national security perspective, wearing that hat, we've got a list of felonies lining up here, right? Kidnapping, assault, right? So abduction equals kidnapping. When medical procedures are being conducted without you, giving your consent, when reproductive genetic material is being taken and actual biological beings being produced from it, that certainly looks like a felony. So he starts making this argument that from one perspective, you can look at it that way. But this is a good example to the point you just made with the Bible and using that as a map for everything that could ever exist, that our contemporary 21st century understanding of agency, of criminal behavior, of sovereignty is definitely confounded by this phenomenon. And in my inner circle discussions, like with the John Mack Institute and the metadata project we're conducting with Archives of the Impossible, we're having conversations around needing to develop a new sense of ethics that is tied to non-duality. And again, a frame that exists beyond this lifetime and beyond even a physicalist understanding of what reality is. So you can't talk about these things and what they ultimately mean without realizing that the ground beneath our feet is shifting as we speak, kind of thing, as we're confronted with this information. So part of the data that I'm intimately familiar with because of this metadata research project we're conducting is the Whitley Strieber archives and the John Mack archives. And so in that case, it's not just what Whitley Strieber's saying happened to him, but the many thousands of people who had similar experiences and felt compelled to write in and send letters to he and his wife Anne to describe what happened to them as well. And almost none of those encounters look anything like the military encounters that are being described. Certainly look almost nothing like Colaris, that's for sure. And again, what's fascinating but confounding about this data is that very often life and death seem to be crossed. These domains that we consider separate and distinct get obliterated by these kinds of cases. So what's interesting is while we're in the process of trying to introduce the larger populace to this conversation about these non-human others and craft that they're operating and bodies that we have somewhere in gurneys or whatever, there's a much larger conversation about this phenomenon seeming to almost intentionally blow apart our conceptions of reality. Whether it's intentional or not is unclear. You could certainly make the argument that it is partly intentional to, again, expand our consciousness. So what I would want to bring into the conversation here that maybe people like Lue are not even that familiar with is that when you look really closely at the experiencer lore, for many, many people that have been these abductees and these contactees, they have over time realized that they did grant some sort of agency, but not in their waking state conscious memory. So this becomes very complex because not only are they able to manipulate space-time and implant screen memories and things like that, but many people, when they're on board the craft, seem to come into a greater awareness of themselves, of their own history, involving even histories that predate this incarnation, where they actually recognize these beings and knowing them prior to even knowing their own parents, and being part of a process in which they chose to come into this incarnation in order to fulfill some sort of process of learning to transmute energy. So what we have here is a much more overarching, expansive frame. So again, we get back to liminal frames. We have a frame that supersedes any of the frames that we're currently unconsciously referencing when we ask these questions and provide these answers. So for me, what I want to argue for is absolutely, let's ask the hardest questions, but let's look at all of the data. Let's open up the books here. Really consider experiencers just as much as, if not more than, the military encounters, because part of the irony here is that you kind of can get the implication from reading Lue's book that we have no idea about their intention, their agenda, their feeling towards us. But experiencer lore says everything but that. It's very clear that they do pretty pointedly share certain concerns and messages with human beings. And very often there is this relational dynamic that forms, but only after the ontological shock, right? So sometimes both of these things are involved. Is it shocking? Does it feel like a violation of human rights? Yes. Is it cracking open the human psyche to let people develop a much more expansive worldview that they, in retrospect, feel grateful for, so they would not trade the experience if they had to do it over again? Absolutely. You see that over and over again in the data, not 100% of the time. And again, of course, you have the added complexity of every human being brings a certain frame of reference, an interpretive grid, a stage of consciousness to understand these experiences as well. But these are the many criteria, the many variables we need to bring to bear here to really engage with this conversation the way we need to.
100%. It is really exposing the inadequacies of our epistemological frameworks. to this task. And this is the conversation I'm eager to have, is really what would a new epistemological framework look like going forward to where we have a more comprehensive understanding of what this is. And I'm so grateful for both having you as a conversation partner, but also our listeners as well, because I feel like there's an opportunity here while the conversation in the mainstream is taking place at the pace that it is and going along the paces that I see it going, which we've explored many times before, both personally and on the podcast. We have an opportunity, a unique one, to workshop and look through all of the other avenues of discovery that are available to us that are outside those frameworks. And honestly, it might be the task that we have to carry. It is the mantle we have to bear in order to be proponents and advocates and interested individuals in this topic, and that is to push these frontiers, push these boundaries to better understand what this actually is. So I'm grateful to be a part of this community and be able to do some of that. It really does bring me energy, and it's exciting. And to kind of hold that intention with what we're seeing happen in the larger conversation in the public. So on that note, we thank all of our listeners so much for joining us on this episode 60 of Liminal Phrames. The journey will continue, and we look forward to seeing you next time. May the quality of our questions, shaped by a desire for understanding, enhance our journey of discovery. And may our travels broaden the sphere of our consciousness, reminding us that new discoveries beget new horizons. As always, adventure awaits. We'll see you next time on Liminal Phrames.